Thank you so much, Waddell. Really appreciate it. Just wanted to thank everyone for being here for our fifth Public Safety Task Force meeting. I know that this is clearly coming up on a holiday weekend for a lot of, or holiday week for a lot of people, and so I know people are trying to wind down. And whether you're spending time with your family or spending more time alone this year due to COVID-19, I recognize that makes it even more important, and I appreciate it even more that you're spending this 3 hours with us this evening. Obviously, we know this is a very important subject, and just once again, continue to appreciate the task force's attention to all of this. So looking forward to yet another great meeting, and just thanks everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. And next on our agenda, we have Brianne Fisher with public comment, and those comment cards will be read into the record.
Okay, just getting one, we have one submitted, getting it pulled up. This was sent to all of the task force members in the last email that I sent. To start, dear members of the Public Safety Task Force, the slap on the wrist for Officer Ronald Krzyja is just another example of how the Tempe Police Department minimizes serious and potentially criminal conduct by officers when the victims of police misconduct are men of color and others viewed by Tempe police as a lesser status. In 2012, it came to light that Detective Tony Trout concealed evidence in the 2007 Darren Gibson murder case. Further, he concealed evidence in crimes involving women and children and lied about his conduct. As a result, multiple serious felony cases went cold, were tainted from future investigation and prosecution, and a killer went free. Trout slap on the wrist. He gave up 2 weeks of accumulated vacation and received a 2-week suspension like Krzyja, but kept his job and pension. There's a link for an article there. In 2013, there was 2 murders committed in Mesa with a stolen pistol taken from Alvin, an elderly man who lived in Tempe. He was robbed of his nephew, Keshawn Green, a convicted felon on probation at the time of the crime. When Alvin had evidence, Green had stolen his pistol along with the medication for pain and his Social Security money. Alvin contacted Tempe police. He was literally given the "it's not my job" excuse by Detective Charles Fiennes. Detective Fiennes passed the case off to the disabled desk officer, Pam Norris, who was awaiting medical retirement. Alvin's burglary case had already been closed by the police with no investigation. Then Lieutenant Pooley reportedly told the media that early disclosure of the burglary case was consistent with the departmental policy, which states no further investigation was justified. Even with the leads about a felon in possession, a stolen gun, and narcotics, Tempe police failed to respond with an urgency or an effort at all beyond pushing more paper into a system where the information died. Both of Green's Mesa's murder victims were men of color. Fiennes was promoted to homicide, and the female desk officer was made the scapegoat, and the matter was closed. Another link was provided. Just like in the Krzyja case, the victims of the Tempe officers' misconduct, laziness, and failure to perform their jobs based on the law and training are all men of color. The officers were all white, and in the end, the officers who failed miserably kept their jobs, promotions, benefits, pensions, and the victims of misconduct were treated as second-class citizens, not to mention the serious crimes that were committed that led to more victims because of police inaction. One has to wonder if Tempe police failed to properly investigate these crimes because of the victims in these cases were people of color without high social status, like a professional athlete. Further, the lack of accountability of these officers, detectives, supervisors, and leadership for these egregious failures continue to impact the lives of crime victims and their families and made Tempe that much more dangerous. The outcome of Krzyja case in just one more known example of the bias that appears to be part of the culture of the Tempe Police Department. It's been consistently overlooked and even rewarded by city management, city legal staff, and past elected leadership. For the first time in my recollection, Tempe has a mayor who sees a need for change in Tempe's policing practices. We see that in the Public Safety Task Force, a bold move by the mayor considering Tempe's past and in-house resistance at PD and City Hall to change. I firsthand I've seen firsthand during my service on the Police Citizen Review Board and Family Justice Commission how the police department and City Hall block and obstruct change and do their best to control outcomes in order to protect their own interests. The Public Safety Task Force is the first time an independent group has been assembled to look at the police department under a very public microscope. I've watched as the police department performs true to form to control the task force directions and outcomes. The police department and their allies have plenty to protect. And that's why it's incumbent on the task force to be the catalyst for real change and not more window dressing. As the Michael Connolly character, Los Angeles Police Department Detective Harry Bosch says, everybody counts or nobody counts. It's time for Tempe to prove that. This comment was submitted by Tempe resident Bill Richardson. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Brianne. And with that, just as a reminder, when you're on the Miro board, if you click on the arrow in the upper right-hand corner of the frame, which looks like a PowerPoint slide, you'll be able to move to the next frame that we're on. So with that, we'll turn it over to Rosenchelsky.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everyone, especially I know this is a holiday week, so thank you again for your generosity of your time. My introductions will be very quick, much like what we always see is kind of taking a temperature and looking at where we are in this process. The conversation was at the last meeting to finish up some strategy discussion that will feed into the strategic plan, and knowing that we will not finish that work tonight, that we will extend to a couple of meetings in January. So if we look at the next slide, as we have seen, it is the Tuckman's model regarding forming, storming, and I'd like to share with all of you, we're actually in the performing. We have a clear vision of and purpose. We understand that the goals before us, and I think at the end of this meeting at 7 o'clock, we will actually see a document that we can take stock in and know that the strategies and the strategic plan is coming together. And looking at where we've been, we started this work in October. And just so a quick snapshot of where we are, as the mayor said, we are in our 5th meeting, and we will continue for a couple more meetings. We are now in December and looking at the strategic planning framework. We will look at the strategies, the homework that we so fondly and kindly asked you to do in December. And I heard from a few of you, so I really appreciate the time. So I know many of you have been working on it. So we will get that together today, and then we will have a presentation from Officer Lindsey McCall, and she will share her perspective as far as an officer. And that was a direct response to what we have heard from all of you of saying that we would like to understand a day in the life of the officer. So once again, today's process, current events, and we will have some time to look at any current events that we would like to discuss. Strategic planning is really the breakout session of the homework that you were assigned. We will break out into rooms for 45 minutes, facilitated once again by Wydell, myself, and Jonay. The large group discussion will take the 9 to 12 ideas that you all decide on in the small groups, bring them together in the larger discussion where we would now feed into the strategic plan. The initial recommendations will be transparent to everyone. And then at the second half of the meeting for 45 minutes, for 20 minutes about Officer Lindsey will share her perspective. And thank you, Lindsey. I really appreciate you sharing this with the group, and an additional questions Q&A at the end that'll help decide some next steps in January. So thank you for those of you who have asked for this presentation. And we will move forward. Thanks, Wydell.
Thanks, Rosa. So I'm on frame 3.01. So again, if you're following, I have a circle around my face at the top of the Miro screen. Just a reminder too, if you are on a mouse, if you zoom in and out, it'll adjust for your screen. Or if you're on a track, you can pinch in and out. So I know sometimes we forget some of the easy things that we can do, and it's always a learning curve. So if you're lost, just put something in chat and we'll try to get you back to us. So again, like Rosa said, at the last meeting, we gave you some homework, and we really do appreciate everybody's attention to that. It helped doing it was at your request that we do some offsite homework. And so we created that for you, which really helps move along our process here and gives everybody time to think about their ideas and their specific actions, programs, initiatives that they think that should be part of the recommended strategic plan. I'm going to go ahead and move to frame 3.02. We're going to take a little bit of time to go back over our individual brainstorm, and then we will share in a group, and then move to a full group discussion. This is just part one. We will, at our next session in January, complete this process with what I'm calling a part two, creating some overarching strategies that bundle all of these specific actions. And these will be the actions that you've put forward by your small groups. And then we'll name emergent overarching things that we can kind of describe when we do our elevator speech, if you will. You know, we'll have specific things that we can talk about as far as what do all of these actions mean. So your homework, and I'm on frame 3.03, is what are specific concrete actions, policies, or procedures that we could take that would move us forward towards trust, accountability, and dialogue between the community and the police. And I'd like to just share a quick story with you. I know we haven't shared a lot personally along the way, but to kind of get you in the frame of mind in regards to when we talk about actions and we want to avoid general principles. Principles help guide us, but it's the specific actions that will actually be the game changer for our environment and trying to reach our vision of trust and accountability and dialogue. I have a 13-year-old daughter. She plays volleyball, and earlier this year she set a goal to be on a national club team. And when she set that goal, I asked her, I said, well, she always asks, what do you do at work, Mom? So I said, oh, time for some strategic planning. And I asked her, I said, well, what do you need to do in order to make that team, in order to move from the current state to the state that you want to be in? What do you need to do? And she says, well, I need to train hard. And I said, that's great. That's a great action, but it's really kind of a general principle. So what would you do specifically about training hard? And she said, oh, I will do 3 repetitions of my daily circuit each day on my off days of training. So that's great. That's a real specific action. I can see it. You know when you've done it. You know when you've crossed that finish line. And then on another one, I asked her, I said, well, what could you do in regards to teamwork? Because everybody says, oh, teamwork's such a great principle. Then I asked her, I said, what specifically could you do? And she goes, oh, when I'm on the sidelines and I'm not on the court, I can be sure that I'm cheering for my team and helping call whether the ball's in or out. And that shows great teamwork and sportsmanship. So the difference is, what I'm trying to illustrate is that we have general principles that guide us, but then we can have specific actions that we can take. And I gave an example in your homework. So I'd like to move to frame 3.04. So one of the things that we're looking at is concrete actions. The specificity is really what will be the game changer here for us to get to our vision. And one of the things that I asked in the homework was kind of what's something we can do as a first step? What's something important that we could do right away? What's significant? Is there a new model that we need to look at? Is there something we could rearrange? Maybe not throwing everything out, but rearranging some things. What could we do to build on the work of others? So those are for some of the prompting questions in your homework. But I do want to give you an example again of what we're talking about when we talk about principles versus actions. So for example, all strategic plans, people always say improve communication. That's always a great thing to do. But what does that really mean? And in our case here, we might have as an example, publish traffic citation reports with demographic data using a public dashboard. That's different from just improved communication. It gives us a specific, tangible action that we can take. We also, for improving communication, could shift family and victim notification from police officers to our social services professionals. Another would be conducting monthly meetings in regards to coordination with personnel in each neighborhood. So that again is just a contrast between a principle and an action. And then one other example is to, I've heard from the group that we need to center on Black and brown voices, but what does that really mean? An example of that would be nominating 5 more Black or brown representatives to citizen review panel. a specific action in regards to hearing Black and Brown voices is creating a measure that's informed by Black and Brown perspectives. So when we look at demographics again, and then also adding demographic breakdown to incident review and analysis and publish those statistics. So when we're looking at principles, those are kind of the things that guide us. That's kind of the guiding light. But the actions are those specific steps that we might take to move us toward our vision. And you'll notice that in each of the actions, they start with a verb. And so we'll be pushing you towards doing that. So I'd like to give you about 5 minutes to review your homework. And if you are highlighting your 3 key actions that you want to share initially with the group when we break you into small groups. So if you could spend a few minutes doing that, we'll take a pause here and let you go back to your homework and see if you have an idea that you can maybe start creating that into an action, or if you had a general principle that you would like to make more specific that would help us in really capturing your idea when you share it in the small group. So we'll just spend a few minutes doing that here. And I'm open for questions in chat, or if you need to ask to the group, that'd be great. Someone else might be thinking the same thing and have the same question. Okay. I see people looking at their homework. Wait, thank you. Hi, Viri. Glad you're on board tonight with us. right, thank you all. Just wanted to kind of get you back into the mode of when you were working on your homework. We had a great question from Michael in regards to what if the guiding principles are flawed, or is the root of the flaw? And I did respond to that with some help from others in regards to actions come together to inform the broader strategy. And then sometimes it gets us a better way to understand that principle and what is unclear about the way we're expressing our principles. One of the things, Michael, and I want to thank you for that question. As we move to frame 3.05, this was part of the initial framework that that we were utilizing in regards to some repeated topics. Some of them came up as guiding principles, others came up as specific ideas, but these are some of the things that were built, the action items could be built around, or others that weren't possibly on the list here. So just wanted to kind of bring you back to your data from the pre-survey, the SWOT analysis, and what was informing from the case study that we did. So I'm moving to frame 3.06. And with this, if you could stay here with me for a little bit, we're going to be moving into small group discussion. And Rosa, Janae, and I will facilitate that discussion for you. And what we're going to ask you to do is for each person to share one of their ideas with the small group. And we'll do round robin in sharing those ideas. We're not going to be scribing at that time. We won't be doing sticky notes at that time. We really just want to try to listen and understand what each person's ideas are. We'll do at least 3 round robins of that. So just share one idea at a time, and then we'll move to the next person. As a group then, you'll then decide on 9 to 12 actions. You may have to combine some actions because they were relevant to each other. In regards to maybe coming up with something else that you wouldn't have thought of without each other's ideas. Then we're going to ask you to summarize those ideas into about 3 to 7 words. And again, if you can start with an action, that would be helpful. And then decide as a group, what are the most self-explanatory and essential that you would like to bring to the larger group for discussion. So we'll still have an idea of what each small group, what emerges from each small group based on the ideas that you've generated individually, and then now as a small group that you can kind of come to agreement on that should move to the larger group. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Elisa to go ahead and move us into our breakout rooms. If you click on the button in the right-hand corner, you'll see which breakout room that you were in last time. We've kept with the same rooms just for simplicity's sake. And so if you are in room 1, you'll be joining me in the Zoom breakout. In room 2, you'll join Janae, and in room 3, you'll join Rosa. So thanks, Elisa, for moving us there. So because this is part 1, we know that we have, we're going to ask each group to move probably 4 to 5 of the action items onto the 3.08 frame, which is the full group discussion. So if we can ask the scribes to go ahead and do that, and we'll just go over the few that we move over tonight to show you what the rest of the process will look like. In January, we'll pick up where we're leaving off tonight in regards to this planning process. So if you didn't get all your ideas out, I know our group got through 3 rounds and then got some items on the board. We'll continue that in January as well. So I'm going to go ahead and have, I'll start with my room as room 2 and 3 can start moving some items over. One of the things, let me move really quick here, just a moment. And so if you can follow me, you can see where I'm going to be on the next frame, which is 3.08. Okay. And for my group, I just pulled 3 of our cards that you spent more of your time talking about. It doesn't mean they're more important than one of the other cards, but I did want to share that with you. So I've just pulled 3 for right now. If Brianne and Elisa can do the same for their group, that would be helpful. So I have to zoom in to really read these cards. So you may have to as well on your Miro board. Remember, you can either scroll or pinch your pad. That will help you. So let's see here. We're moving over. Okay. We've gotten some common ideas. We're kind of organizing here. And Brianne, if you can drop your cards into the purple, try to look for, okay. Okay. So we'll just start with the purple box A. I'm on frame 3.08. Again, if you want to follow me, my face is in the circle at the top of the Miro board. I have 10 followers. It's probably more followers than I have on Twitter at this time anyway. So just to let you know that. So the first item that we'll look at is in box A. It was about creating a Tempe advocacy center and doing a preliminary transition with Human Services to get that started sooner rather than later. And so in box B, we had established a family bill of rights that would include a family liaison, an advocate to follow the investigation, advocates to be determined, access to body-worn camera and report immediately within 48 hours. Also in that box, we had establishing a family and victim bill of rights, using police as a funding source, designating civilian individuals that are implemented and interact with the individuals, kind of a central point of contact. And then in box C, we had require ongoing physical and fitness and flexibility standards, testing and evaluation to metrics annually at a minimum. Also establish a community liaison position between public safety and city manager's office. I think we'll have to find a new spot for that one. Establish a participatory budget process specifically designated for Tempe PD. So I'm not sure that that fits with item C. So I'll move those over just so we have them there. Box E, issuing an RFP for data analytics to inform policing policy with public and frequent reporting. Track officer behavior in box F. Track officer behavior toward mental health metrics more often than the annual evaluation to those metrics. Adopting an independent and stringent evaluation to ensure officers are fit for duty. Operationalize a Tempe contract with well-defined and supervised with well-defined parameters and define and supervised guidelines. And then in box H, we have create a reinvestment roundtable to show where funding is allocated and safety is achieved. I think I'm going to establish a participatory budget process and move that to box H. Those might seem similar. And then a community liaison position between public safety and city manager's office. Maybe that stands alone for now. So I want to ask the group here, what do we have these grouped as far as the intentions go are in the right area for you? Okay. I do have a question about box C, require ongoing physical fitness and flexibility standards. Did that include mental health as well? And that was in the group room 2 provided that card. If somebody from room 2 could speak to the intent of that, or is that separate from a mental health concept?
It's both. That physical requirements are necessary, and then also a mental health evaluations.
Okay, thanks, Viri. I'm going to go ahead and move that to some of the ones that we have in regards to mental health evaluations and metrics. Is that okay? So we'll move that one. And let's see what else. And in the gold group, that was group 3 that Rosa facilitated. Can you speak to about the community liaison position, what the intention behind that one?
Roy, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I will. So basically, the community liaison position would be, I believe, would be the culmination of this group to make it real in the city. This position will be housed in the city manager's office, reporting to the city manager, but working with Tempe Police Department, all public safety entities, human services, and also specifically the mayor's office. So the mayor can consistently be informed of what's going on in real time with the police department, especially given the public interest in what's happening with Tempe Police Department. And also this liaison position can also ascertain needs and desires and priorities to the city manager if additional resources needed to be allocated in certain spaces.
Okay, thank you, Roy. And then I've moved 2 more cards over. One was create fit for duty physically and mentally evaluation specific to reflect community expectations on an ongoing basis. And then in box C, develop a robust data collection system for the PD, allowing for accurate reports to create policies, process, and build community trust. Any clarification needed on any of the cards that we have so far?
Well, for the data one, we want to make sure that there's demographic data and geolocated data recorded for every police stop and citation. But especially, you know, it's important to include police stops because they can be revealing.
Okay. Oops. Okay. And I'll go ahead and ask our scribes to go ahead and move another card in. Okay, I'm going to move a card that's similar to the one that Lauren, you just had us clarify. It's in regards to data. It came from, it came from group 1, and it was about gather, track, and report key performance indicators, create transparent and open data governance, publish in real time, implement electronic system to collect data, include key stakeholders, define operational public safety and data. And then we'll move over, ensure that data is the foundation of all policy recommendations. Do we agree that should go in group box C? I'm seeing heads nod. And then we have create an unarmed unit that responds to nonviolent crimes. Would that be a different box? Somebody can make a recommendation in regards to which box you think it should go in. That maybe go to the Advocacy Center.
Melody, were you going to speak on that one, or let's see, or I saw you step up. I'm looking for who might have from our group. Hassan, you or Melody want to speak on that one?
Hey, I'm trying to catch up here.
So in the boxing, we were on your recommendation of the unarmed law enforcement unit that responds to nonviolent crimes. Do you think that falls in the bucket of what we've been describing so far? Or would it stand in a category on its own?
Which box is it in?
I think, Wydell, based on how we were doing our groupings and how that that one came in, that it would be a separate box.
Separate one, okay.
Yeah, Hassan, we're moving it from our group over to the main, so I don't think that it falls squarely under any strategy that we've talked about so far.
Okay. Let's see, we have expansion of CARE 7, including revamped education and training. Where might we see that go? Maybe somebody from the from the group 3 Rosa's group could tell us where they'd like that one to go, or?
Jacob, do you care specifically where it goes? I know it's kind of hard to see all 9 square.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Would
Yeah,
it
it's a
go
little
within?
difficult. I was kind of, I'm admittedly a little blind. Roy, if you may want to assist me on this, I appreciate it.
Would that align to the Advocacy Center recommendation? I'm
I
seeing a
don't,
few heads.
I think we can place it there right now, Wydell, unless
Sure.
Jacob or Roy say anything different, because
Okay.
Advocacy Center is really looking at
Mhm.
the same functions that a Care 7 would also. There would
Right.
be intersectionality of that. We can place
Okay.
it there for now.
Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Uh,
We also have reforming the Tempe Citizens Review Panel's responsibilities, processes, and functions. I'm thinking that's a new box.
I haven't seen anything that kind of aligns with that.
Yeah,
Wydell, so
okay.
that might be in the
Thank you.
corner pocket. Yep.
Okay. Reimagine 911 call center.
And that was talking about creating an alternate dispatch system, not with police, but maybe expanding 311 and re-examining the Tempe non-emergency line number as well. So how we
Okay.
social service calls. So
Okay.
probably is with that previous group where we're talking about the Care 7 expansion.
Okay. Reimagining 911. And we do
Wydell.
have box E because I just moved another data piece over that I had misplaced. Jonee?
we also discussed a marketing plan needs to accompany that as well.
Okay. What about establish grassroots strategies for diverse and inclusive officer recruitment?
Sorry, really
Wydell.
quick, just to add on, I don't think it's reimagining 911. I think it's literally recreating something completely separate of 911. I don't know if reimagining 911 is the way that we want to phrase that.
Okay. What was the intent behind that from the group 3?
There are other services that can be rendered from the city when a person is in a crisis, not necessarily a crime, and but most people only know 911 when they're in a crisis.
Okay. So that's where the reimagine comes into play there. Okay.
Correct.
And then,
Wydell?
sorry, yes.
Sorry, I know you were about to move to
That's
another
okay.
gold one, but I put in the notes that it seems like from the tenor of what everyone's saying, the idea that the gold group had about unarmed law enforcement would be to respond to nonviolent crimes, which would be the ones that are, maybe Care 7 or the ones that are a new 911 that is a nonviolent crime call. So
Okay.
that might be a natural shoot of that process.
So reimagine 911, move it down to the unarmed response
I think that's what I
to
was
get to the
hearing
attention.
from.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate the clarification. Launch a plan to build relationships between the community and line level officers. Trying to find where that might go.
I think you were reading the recruitment, the diverse recruitment. We didn't get a chance to go into that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me go back to that one.
That was the easy one.
Establish grassroots strategies for diverse and inclusive officer recruitments.
And the reason why I wanted to mention that and wanted you to revisit that is because I wanted to suggest that the city begin to reach out to our historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, to extend that recruitment process. There are a number of HBCU alumni in the Valley. I am one of them as well. And so I know we would be happy to begin to build relationships between the HBCU students and those departments and the city of Tempe, if that's something that the city was committed to doing.
Okay, I noted that on the card, Roy. Thank you.
No problem.
Those help. Okay, then I'm going to move over to launch a plan to build relationships between the community and line level officers. Would that go also with how we recruit officers? He is a home for now. And then grassroots strategies, I think I duplicated that one, my apologies. Reframing discipline and assessment informed by data. Suggestions on where we might put that one. Okay. And reinventing the police model, determining badged and unbadged roles in public safety. So I'm going to leave those two here. Oh, sorry, somebody moved it. Thank you. Moved it to the other one. And reframing discipline and assessment informed by data. So for our time's sakes here, we're going to pause on this, and we can continue this at our next session in January. We will come back around to all of this in regards to the ideas and the specific actions. So this isn't the end of it. The one thing too that we'll also to do is start naming these boxes, which will be helpful in regards to making sure that the actions are aligned to the intent that each group had as they move them forward towards our larger group here. And so with that, we will go ahead and take a session break of about 5 minutes. And when we come back, we'll start our second half of the session tonight. So we'll go ahead and start the clock at 5 minutes. So we'll come back at 5 o'clock and 46 minutes. 5:46. We'll see you in a moment. Our next part of tonight's session, I wanted to just clarify that before our session in January, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the evening with Rosa and the mayor, we will send to you the beginnings of the framework of the strategic plan. So you'll see the ideas and actions that you've put forward tonight. We'll do our best to group them more. And any mistakes will be mine, but you'll give a chance to, as we said in our first session with the mayor, he kept getting amended by members of his group. So we can always amend and make those changes to that kind of initial framework. So it's kind of like doing a homework project as a group. We'll do a draft and make sure that everybody in the group gets it. And then we can make some changes at our next session if we maybe have gotten it wrong. So with that, I'd like to go over to, I'm actually on frame 4.01 with ready to introduce Interim Police Chief Jeff Glover for the next part of our session in a life in the day of the officer.
Do you mind, before we do that, I just have a quick concern.
Sure,
just
Jacob.
speaking for myself. I just wanted to better understand how some of the, how the framework is going to go for, the information that we just collected in our respective groups.
Right.
Because in these, this homework that we were given, a lot of the information and feedback that we have is very extensive. And I'm afraid that if we're not in control of the narrative and the conversation, that the outcome is not going to be in something of our favor. So there's some other strategic plans and things of that nature that I feel that we should discuss in depth. Specifically things such as the de-escalation and use of force policies, training and mindset. That's something that can't be encapsulated into like a suggestion or like a action item and things of that nature. So I had to bring that up.
Oh no, I appreciate that. So we will go back to other ideas that are still out there that we haven't yet got to in your round robins in your small group, and we'll be able to bring those forward to the group. The good news is we're recording all of the discussion so that we can also then capture the intention behind the recommendations. And as you said, this is very, complex in regards to how this, it's very hard to boil it down into just a few phrases, but this is just the part where we get started. Each of these items will eventually have an entire implementation plan around the adopted recommendations. So there'll be a lot, the context, I think, Jacob, is what you're referring to, correct?
I just wanted to make sure that we're able to fully discuss these issues in depth. Just going by them, spending a few seconds, a minute or two on each item is not enough time to really to dive into these issues and
Mhm.
discuss how they're really impacting the community.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a topic of concern. So
Okay.
I feel like I needed
Thank
to bring
you.
that up.
Thank you. I appreciate that you did.
Jacob, may I jump in here? Thank you for making those comments. I think that is why the additional sessions we had discussed, perhaps having some more sessions to discuss and flesh out some of these recommendations and strategies.
Mhm.
What you saw tonight is just kind of identifying buckets and action words or action ideas. The next session in January, there'll be 2, and that's the recommendation. And I'm just going to jump in
Mhm.
because this is something we're going to discuss at the end. The next session shouldn't be breakout sessions. It really should be the whole group looking at all the recommendations that came from the smaller, like our group, Jacob, that were brought forward, and to start having discussions as a group of a whole, because now we really need to create the framework that get adopted. And to Wydell's point, this is a strategic plan. There should be an implementation plan that even fleshes things out. If you remember, Shireen in our breakout session said, I may be getting into the weeds of things. So we need to differentiate what's the strategic plan, high level, and then what are the things that are going to be recommendations for the implementation team to consider as to make sure that it memorializes the intent of what is being said. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but I'm just concerned that this lack of information, lack of insight when it comes to the specific issues is going to be used as a foundation for policy when we have so much to discuss. For instance, looking at this de-escalation paperwork, which a lot of us have been working on from a collaborative standpoint over the weekend, that's a whole session in itself, you know, an entire date in itself. Looking at this is just even getting through naming these bullet points will take 2 or 3 minutes in themselves. So how could we have any sort of, long-standing policy change if we're not able to really fully dive into each individual issue on its own, especially if we don't feel that we're given the opportunity to voice our perspectives, as we are the ones who are directly impacted and represent a community of impacted individuals.
I hear you, Jacob, absolutely. And this is so, I mean, we could actually spend an entire year discussing some of these things. So I think at the next session, I would recommend that we start off the meeting with identifying, looking at what we have before us and identifying what are the subject areas that we would need to flesh out a little bit more, to your point. Use of force, I think data in our meeting, in our subgroup, was a lot of discussion regarding data. I think some mental health. So we have subject matter experts, and perhaps we need to hear from them that might be helpful for some examples of things that we need to discuss. So please know that we don't want to leave this group and end this without people feeling like we discussed that to the fullest extension to make sure that it memorializes what the group wants to advance.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I'll introduce Interim Chief Police Chief Jeff Glover.
Yes, thank you, Wydell, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to make an introduction of Lindsey McCall Long. She was a retired police officer with the Tempe Police Department, and she's going to be going over just a day in the life of what it is being out as a police officer in patrol, and giving you a perspective of that, as well as just some ideas as to what that entails in terms of how that work-life balance actually interacts, and what her interaction is with the community, as well as some other examples of things that she has dealt with and experienced within her career. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Long.
Hello, everybody. All right. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So as Chief Glover said, my name is Lindsey McCall Long, and I am a retired Tempe police officer, newly retired as of the end of August of this year. It was a medical retirement due to an injury, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. But I had a total of about 17 years in law enforcement. I started my career in Georgia at Gwinnett County Police Department. I was there for about 4.5 years before moving to Arizona. I worked for Paradise Valley Police Department for about 1.5 years, and then Tempe. I know Paradise Valley is a short period. I know a lot of people were like, man, only 1.5 years, but it was a lot smaller and a lot slower than what I was used to. And I like to engage with the public, and you have a lot of part-time residents over there, so you don't get to engage with the public as much. Most of my career, I've worked patrol. I like patrol. You get to talk to people, do new things every day. Anybody who knows me knows I like to talk. I can make friends with a brick wall. And I like just doing something new every day. I was never a sit behind a desk type of person. I have done some investigation, undercover stuff, vice and narcotics, and a little bit with our crime prevention unit as well. So I live here in the Valley. I'm married. I have 2 young kids, one of which turned my camera on earlier, so I apologize if you saw a little fluffy head pop in. You know, like I said, I grew up in Georgia. I'm a victim of violence, if you will. My dad was murdered when I was 17. And I remember the detectives that came to the house to do the death notification. And it was like the coldest, most nonchalant death notification, that I remember. And I always remember thinking, like, you know, if that were me, like, I wouldn't tell somebody that their family member had just been murdered the way they did. It was just kind of like, oh, well, this is what happened. And they kind of moved on. And so when I got into law enforcement, you know, I kind of wanted to be that change I wanted to see. I wanted to have that compassion with people. And when I was in college, I had to do an internship with the police department. And at first, you know, I didn't know what to expect because I only knew of law enforcement what I'd seen on TV. And so, you know, you're out chasing the bad guys all day long, and, you know, people get into several, altercations before lunchtime, and everything's wrapped up in a nice, neat bow in an hour, and everybody goes home. So I was doing my internship, and I finally saw something that grabbed my attention, which was an officer, not just being an enforcer, but he was actually being a friend. You know, he sat down, had a conversation. He was offering resources to somebody, and that spoke to me. So throughout my career, I've always prided myself on my communication skills. I was lucky to have supervisors who allowed me to hone in my communication skills early in my career. And that's something I've always focused on. I think the ride along helped me see policing in a different way also. One of the officers I rode with, I asked him one night, I said, hey, it seems like we do a lot of sitting still and report writing. And he was like, yeah, you know, when you get into this, you'll find out that this is a lot of, you're like a secretary with arrest powers. There is a lot of paperwork involved in this. So I learned a few other things that I didn't know going into it. And, you know, as a female in law enforcement too, I know my limit, you know, so I knew that communication would be my best tool in dealing with people when I was out on calls. You know, to me, it's a lot easier to talk somebody down than just try to muscle somebody around with strength, because that doesn't help anybody. All it does is anger both sides, and nobody has a resolution. As far as, you know, I learned a lot in academy, but then once you get out of academy and you get on the street, you learn even more. You know, a lot of our day starts before we even hit the road. You know, you have your briefings or your roll calls where a lot of information is disseminated. You have your administrative duties, you know, you have your training. And now in a day of COVID, a lot more training is online. So you have a lot more virtual trainings. You got paperwork you got to fill out, things from the night before. So you have a lot of administrative stuff, like I said, to do before hitting the street that day. And the amount, like I started in 2003, and the amount of paperwork we do now is a lot more than it used to be. And it takes up a lot more of your time. You know, we have changing laws, especially in our DV laws here. You know, we have a domestic violence lethality assessment form that has to be filled out. And you know, not to age myself, when I started policing, we were handwriting reports, and everybody was so excited about going to a computerized system. It was going to be so much easier and so much quicker. But over time, we find it to be a little bit more daunting, because now everything's just in electronic form, and it's a lot easier to make everything electronic form and say, hey, there's one more form you got to add to that report, or one more form you got to add to this. So what used to be a 15 page report is now turned into 2025. And it takes time to do some of that stuff. You know, I feel like over the years, a lot more, when I look at my career, I could definitely say a lot more duties have been put on police officers that we didn't have to do before. Something I didn't know coming into it, but like I said, I kind of learned a little bit on my ride along, is police officers wear a lot of different hats. You know, it is, you know, sometimes you are the enforcer, you are holding people to task and taking them to jail for wrongdoing, or sometimes you're a friend, sometimes you're an ear, you're a resource person, you're a lot of different things. And I don't think a lot of officers realize that coming into it. They think they're just going to be out arresting people and things like that, but it is a lot more to it. And I mean, I've done everything from, yeah, I'm taking you to jail, to letting somebody cry all over my shoulder because this is the worst day of their life. When I started, you know, there was no, you can have a weakness, you know, there was no, hey, Sarge, I got an issue, I need to talk about it, because that was seen as a weakness and people would get on you for it. Oh, you can't be out here. You knew what came with the job, but sometimes you don't know what comes with the job until you're there. There are some things that we can be prepared for, but some things you don't know until you're in the shoes. But that's why I think it's important to have conversations like what's happening right now, to have the mental health resources that we're slowly but surely getting better at. For officers, you know, because if you ask an officer out on the street right now, they could probably rattle off 5 different places they can point a citizen to go get assistance for mental health. But sometimes we can't rattle off that many resources for ourselves to go get mental health. Let me see, about 2 years ago was when my critical incident happened. And, leading into my critical incident, I unknowingly was doing some work that ended up helping me once my shooting happened. Me and my zone partner were shot, trying to serve an order of protection during what stemmed from a domestic violence situation. She was shot once, I was shot 3 times. And the year leading into my critical incident, you know, I didn't want to be a statistic like we had been learning about. Tempe was doing more trainings on health and wellness and offloading everything that we see and do, on the job every day. And so I started seeing a therapist, and I had no problem with telling people I was seeing a therapist because I felt like it was needed. I was taking better care of myself. My family was in a good place. And then my critical incident happened. And a lot of people expected me to be a lot further down in the hole than I actually was after the shooting happened. I've had my emotional ups and downs, physical ups and downs. Again, this is what led to my my medical retirement. But being in a good place, having family support, having departmental support is what helped me, and me knowing where to go for resources. When I look back at my career, you know, I can tell, I've always been a night owl. You know, I like to stay up late, watch TV, whatever. But when I look back, I can pinpoint it was after I became a police officer that I started having trouble sleeping, and that maybe things that I didn't recognize as anxiety started to set in because I didn't know what it was called and nobody really talked about it. Now, you know, we talk about things like cumulative stress and PTSD and stuff like that. And we weren't talking about that back then. All I knew is I was having trouble sleeping, and sometimes I got angry and I didn't know why. I remember, I remember a particular incident where, I just felt like I was falling apart, but there was nobody really to talk to about me falling apart and why it felt like that. And obviously it caused issues at home and, things like that. And I started to become a different person. And along the way, like I said, I had some good people in my corner. So, I was like, okay, I had people that would take me aside and say, hey, listen, this isn't who you are. This isn't who we know you to be. Like, what's going on? And I remember a few months, like probably about 6 months before my shooting happened, I didn't like feeling like a hypocrite out in the street, because I'm standing in front of somebody whose life is falling apart and I'm giving them all these things to do with their life, but I wasn't doing the same things. I wasn't taking care of myself physically. I wasn't taking care of myself mentally, but yet I'm going to stand in front of you and tell you how to do these things. And so I didn't like that. And so those were some of the reasons why I started working on myself and started getting to a point where I did feel good about the things that I was saying to people when I was out on the street. Like I said, I have 2 young kids, and if I'd made it to my 20 years and retired, my kids would probably be middle school age. And, I didn't want to be a stranger to my family. I didn't want to be that angry person walking around the house all the time. They're like, oh, mom's home. You know how she gets sometimes, so that's why I chose to do that work. And I understand not everybody has that insight. And some officers feel like they can't show weakness because they feel like they're a superhero of sorts, but all superheroes have weaknesses. I've told myself often, and I didn't start my career like this, but, I am a person that wears a uniform. I'm not my uniform at the end of the day. If I step onto a scene with a call, I lead the call with being Lindsey, not Officer Long, because I am a person. And I have a family that I go home to that, I want to be level-headed for. And, I do know that over the years, I've experienced some traumas on the job that should have been dealt with mental health help, but I didn't. And, over a, 20, 25 year career, I mean, people can experience, hundreds of small traumas. And you kind of get to the point where you just get used to it. You're like, well, I signed up for this. And that's when people start telling you, well, you should have known what to expect. This is part of the job. But it doesn't have to stay that way. It doesn't have to, stay there, and you don't have to feel that anxiety and that anger and everything that comes with, not being able to unload how you feel all the time. And, my sleep is getting better, things like that. I still see my therapist. And like I said, I'm not able to do the job anymore. So that added another layer to it. But, I am happy that, I can still be around the Tempe Police Department to be involved in things like this. And there's a few other groups that I'm involved in the city to have these conversations with people and to be there as a resource for police officers who may feel like otherwise, someone else who hasn't walked in their same shoes may not know how they feel. It is hard, and self-realization is hard. Admitting that you have a problem and things need to be changed can be hard sometimes. But there are a couple of people on this call right now that I've had to reach out to over the years when things were just falling apart for me and I didn't know what to do. And I did use that, and I think as officers, we have to get over that being afraid to show a weakness or be vulnerable. And if there's somebody here, I've had conversations with Rosa, several years ago, where it's like, well, I'm here. If you need to have a conversation, I'm here for you. I don't have a problem with that. I could probably look at in this call, probably at least 5 or 6 people that I've reached out to over the years to discuss personal issues. And, trauma is a tricky thing. You think you can be okay one day, and then all of a sudden you're not okay. And you have no idea where it comes from. And that's where I think some of our first line supervisors, it's very important too, you know, for our first line supervisors to be in tune with our officers, because they're the ones that have the most contact with our officers out there to know what's going on with people. And some days, you know, you'll have a day where you can just kind of sit around in your car all day, catch up on paper, just kind of have a chill day. And other days it is back to back. I mean, just back to back calls. You're not going to get a break at all. And sometimes, you know, somebody needs to be tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, it's time for you to go check out or go take a walk or go take a breather, because I can tell the day is piling up. You know, divorce rate is high in law enforcement. That's something I never wanted, because, you know, if things are being stressful and falling apart at work, eventually that will bleed into your home life and vice versa. You know, I've seen it with people, and it's hard to, sometimes it's hard for people to separate the two, and they would sooner just be an angry person who feels like nobody understands than kind of address the problem. That's kind of, you know, in a nutshell, kind of what a day in a life looks like. I mean, things from depression to anxiety. I mean, we've seen alcoholism, you know, drug addiction, domestic violence in police marriages and things like that. And a lot of it can stem from the stress of the job, not to give anybody an excuse. You know, I've had my times where I've let the stress kind of run away from me. And, you know, I said some things I shouldn't to somebody at work or on a call. And like I said, I've had the awareness of myself to know when I'm not being myself and to go back and apologize to somebody. You know, like I said, I'm a human being. Sometimes things get stacked up, and as an officer and being type A, sometimes I feel like I can solve everybody's problem, you know, but that's not the case. And again, who am I to stand in front of you to try to solve your problem when I can't even solve my own? And that was a big factor for me, and why I decided to change how I was doing things when I did 2 years ago, which, like I said, you know, it kind of helped overall, but, you know, I'm not on the street anymore. I miss being out there, but I like being able to help where I can. So that's kind of my presentation in a nutshell. Hopefully I've given you all a little bit of a window into kind of what it's like. And it's different for everybody. It's just, you know, and this is not just a Tempe PD thing. I mean, you can look at police departments across the country and across the world. You know, when that stress builds up, and if you don't have proper outlets and resources, you know, this is how we have bad things happen sometimes, and people lose their jobs, their lives, and, you know, so many other things that can happen.
Thank you, Lindsey. Appreciate you sharing your experience with our task force. I always think of when we're trying to understand something that we want to change, it's nice to hear from someone who's experienced it. And while your story may be unique, we really do appreciate you sharing it tonight. With that, I'm going to pass over to Rosa in regards to our next steps. Rosa, I think you're still muted.
I'd just like to, sorry, can I make a quick comment?
Sure, Rudy.
Absolutely, Vidi.
Okay, thank you. Lindsey, yeah, thank you for sharing your experience. I think it's hard right now, and I guess I'm expressing this with everyone, to hold both some things, some realities, and also, you know, thank you for being vulnerable. I think, you know, like in what you're experiencing. And I think that also the hard thing that happens when in one-on-one situations is that we're not looking at also culturally. I think something I heard very clearly, that this is not just happening right now, right? This is not just happening here. This is the root of policing. And I think to the question that Michael has and Dr. Gutierrez have been sharing throughout the whole conversation, if we're not having conversations about the core principles and values that we're shaping around, then we're going to keep having these conversations that are not leading us to actually solving, right? Because like all of these experiences that, you know, we're hearing are happening repeatedly. The domestic violence, the PTSD, that all of these things are happening within a department, you know, some that have resources, some that don't. It's happening in our community where there are no resources. And I thank you, Keisha, and everyone who's talked, like there's no resources. All of this is true in our communities and we don't have access to it. Is hard to navigate. Maybe we don't know, but that's also on our end, right? Like as a city, right? And whoever the providers. And at the end of the day, we can't talk about the fact, like we're not talking about the fact that policing is not that answer. And, you know, we keep separating these two things and it's just been really frustrating today. The whole process has been really frustrating, that we're not talking about what are we doing different, like adding, you know, we have some recommendations that have been brought up throughout the last 5 meetings that have been shown that do not change anything within police, right? Culture competency will not stop the shootings, will not stop the killings, right? And yet those are the ones we feel the most comfortable with and saying we need more trainings, we need more of this. But part of the question is here is like the role of policing needs to change. And, you know, I think Lindsey shared it, like we have all these jobs that we're not responding to that, you know, I'm sure they'll agree that they shouldn't be responding to. And we're not talking about like safety beyond policing still. This whole last 5 meetings, we still talk about police being our only form of safety. And that has been hard and frustrating and, I'm great, again, grateful for sharing and that experience. And also, you know, when y'all brought up Antonio Arce's family and in that case, we talked about it for a long time around like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. We didn't talk about his mom and her expertise as a mom in this experience, right? And a day in a mom's life now, what that looks like. We're not talking about people and humanity where we're like, I don't know, I'm just, you know, trying to capture, I think, all the things. Keisha, thank you so much for everything, your words, and Dr. Gutierrez and everyone on here, but we're not actually having the conversation we need to be having, any of the conversations we should be having. And we're gonna end up with nothing changed and more violence or the same amount of violence if we don't figure out what the hell we're trying to change.
Thanks, Vidi. I know that was heartfelt. I can see it in your face and I can hear it in your words. And I want to thank Lindsey. This wasn't easy for her to agree to this. And this was actually a request from a couple of the committee task force members to have an officer come share their story for that balanced perspective of, I think I saw it in the chat, meeting people where they are, trying to understand from within the organization. And I think that was the request, the life of the officer. So we can have Lindsey stay on and answer any questions, or we can have a conversation about what we're seeing in the chat, seriously, and adjust and just pivot right now. And we still have 40 minutes, but I want to honor the couple of the committee members that really asked for this conversation with an officer. So I'll leave it to the group. What would you like?
I was typing in the chat because I was one of the members that requested this section or this portion happen, because in order to truly bring about change, we have multiple perspectives to consider. We have a community perspective, we have a policing perspective, we have a city perspective, a government perspective, a human perspective. And I in my opinion, I thought it would be important to hear from someone within the police department, so we could hear about what they experience. And so I appreciate Ms. Long for sharing and being as vulnerable. I will say, and I'll just, not to take away from any of that, it will be important to hear from let me just be frank. From those that I don't believe that Ms. Long, if we were to look into your record, I'm sure that your disciplinary file is very thin, and you've not had many complaints, and you've not, abused anyone, gotten away with it. I'm not sure. I'm willing, knowing who you are, I don't believe that that's the type of officer that you are. However, I believe that it's important to hear from. I don't believe that many of your counterparts would be as vulnerable or share as deeply as you've shared. And so I'm happy to have you here. But also, I think it would be important to hear from some of the other officers, even particularly, I think some of the members of the task force we're expecting to hear from maybe a current patrol officer. Just to be frank with you. So that may be a reason for some of the chatter, because it is important for those in patrol, those that are engaging with the people. It's important for us to hear what they're dealing with, and it's important for us to be able to communicate to them. And I believe that also it's important for some other voices to definitely be heard in this. So just wanted to make sure that we take advantage of what we have and work with it to the best of our ability. So we can, just like Vidi just said, what are we trying to reform, or what are we trying to accomplish? We have to have, the police have to be able to understand where we're coming from as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that in your experience, it's like, as a cop who said, I need help, something needs to figure out. And like, that's not what we're seeing, right, overall. And I think you mentioned that, like, overall, there's a culture of like, we can't be vulnerable, we can't ask for help, we can't be. And I think that is what is actually like at the core of the problem. When someone's not going to come out and say, I need help, what are the accountability measures we're setting up so that that cop is not in our streets, right? Even though they are being violent, they have issues, they have PTSD, they're still not willing to say, I need help. And I think for me, that's what I'm thinking about too. Like, the police that are not going to come out and say, and say, you know what, I need help, and like, let me talk to people, and actually, like, this is not something I can do anymore, this is why. It's everyone else who gets away with it, even though it's very clear. If we would look at data, if we would have an early intervention system, if we would like hear victims and survivors of police violence, that there are cops with issues and who are still there. So I don't know if, we just wanted to say that. So thank you for seeking help, and also for highlighting the fact that that is still in the culture, that people are not doing that. And I also agree with Keisha and pivoting.
Would anyone feel comfortable asking Lindsey any questions? And maybe, Vidi, that is the question for Lindsey, if we may, just for a second. Lindsey, what Vidi just said is heartfelt, as far as you were vulnerable, you sought help. Where is the entry point for officers, if I may ask, if you see any, if we were approaching this, obviously, in a prevention with prevention in mind?
There's a couple conversations I've had around the department. I mean, just as far as, like you said, it's a cultural thing, right? So you have people who feel like, well, I can never be weak, I have to be strong. And you start to take on this persona that really isn't who you are. I think as soon as people come through the door, like, you have to know, like, hey, these are things you will experience. This is, when you start developing these symptoms, not being able to sleep, having, outbursts for no reason, things like that, you need to get help, and reminding people over and over again. It can't be a thing of where, every, you're 10 years into your career, and, we want to talk about health and wellness. I think it has to be from day one, and it has to be a part of the organization's culture itself. I've always been very open about wanted to learn more about seeking help because, like I said, I have to look myself in the mirror every day. I have young kids that I'm telling them to be a certain way. And how am I supposed to look myself in the face when I'm not doing the same thing? And there are a lot of issues that come from trauma and that we just don't talk about enough. People too often take on the mentality of it's just a part of the job, and it's not. It doesn't have to be. There are ways to offload it. I've seen things I wish I could forget, and I've seen major things that didn't cause me any problems then, but 2-3 years down the road, now I'm having issues, and it takes time to sift through all the crap that you've seen to be like, that's why I'm having this issue today. We have a peer support team at the police department. I've utilized them, and I've even, some of them were brave enough to come to me when they saw I wasn't acting like myself. So having things like peer support, an active peer support team, whether it's within the police department or connected to it somehow, I think can be a big help, but you got to get people as soon as they come through the door. Hopefully that answers your question some.
Thanks, Lindsey.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Lindsey? And then maybe we can have a conversations.
Yeah, I have a question for Lindsey. Obviously as being a woman on the force is, not a difficult task, not an easy task. But also being a Black woman is even a more complicated task being on the force. So rather than a day in the life of your experiences in the street, maybe give us some examples of the type of racism and discrimination you've experienced from the department in your own, from your own personal experiences. And what are those examples of systemic racism that you've witnessed yourself from your white counterparts?
Well, again, like I said, I started in a different state, right? So when I came out here, it was a little bit of a culture shock when it came to just policing and everything else that went with it. Now, to my knowledge, and I'm being honest, I haven't experienced anything racist inside of my police department that I was aware of. Now, dealing with the public was a different matter. I had a officer asked me how I was adjusting not too long after I'd moved here. And I said, well, it's still interesting. And he asked me why. And I said, well, I've experienced more racist things here since in the 6 months that I had been in Arizona on the street. And he said, yeah, but you're from the South. And I was like, yeah, I said, I don't know. I said, it was hard to explain. I said, I've been called names here that I was never called, back in Georgia. And, I don't know if it was, it's hard for me to pinpoint what it is here that's different than back home. People just didn't say certain things. I have had people on the street say, well, I don't want you to respond either because I was a woman or because I was Black. They didn't want me there. Some of the things that, I've noticed that I'm a little bit more, I pick up on quicker our cultural differences. When you're out here as a police officer, you're going to be dealing with people that you didn't grow up around. You run the spectrum out there. And, I would have to take some officers aside and say, hey, maybe, you got to understand it from this perspective, because if you only are looking at one perspective, you're only looking at how you grew up. Everybody you're dealing with didn't grow up like you. People, they didn't have the same experiences. People don't communicate the same way, and you have to be open to that. And it can't just be my way. I have to be open. And like somebody said, I believe in the chat about meeting people where they are, you have to meet people where you are. A lot of it is not understanding other people's cultures. And, where I was working out in Gwinnett County, we had a lot of different cultures around us often. And so you had no choice but to dig in there, and say, okay, all right, I may be dealing with an African family this day, a Hispanic family this day, an Asian family this day. Where I worked had its own little pockets, and you learned a lot of different cultures very quickly. You know, again, moving out here, the demographics were a little bit different, excuse me. And, you know, I know how to adjust with people and stuff like that. And not all officers can do that. You know, when I talk about getting people through the door, you know, communication is another thing that has to be harped on when we're talking about how to deal with people. And that has to start from day one. It can't just be a every once in a while type of training. How you talk to people is extremely important, you know, because you have to be extremely respectful. You have to understand where people are coming from. And if you don't understand, ask a question. There's nothing wrong with asking a question. You know, like I said, as a female, I'm not, you know, I have to use my communication skills as a female. And you get more flies with honey. You know, I've been able to talk people down where somebody else is trying to yell at them and muscle them around. And I was like, but what's the point? You know, I don't know if it's a personality difference or I don't have anything to prove. You know, I was called here to solve a problem and I'm going to solve it the best way I can. I don't have to be the one to solve the problem. If I have to call somebody else, Care 7, fire department, just somebody else to come solve the problem, that's what I'm going to do. So sometimes I don't know if it's a competition thing or what it is. But like I said, overall, I've not experienced anything within the police department. I've just had some issues out on the street here and there. And it was more so here, oddly enough, you know, like I said, than in Georgia where everybody thought I was going to have issues on the street.
So just to clarify, what I'm hearing you say is that in your time here in the Tempe Police Department, where we know that racism is a problem, that you've never witnessed any sort of racism, whether it was in, you know, the locker room or in the station or, you know, overhearing conversation with your, you know, partners. What you're saying is in a system where we know, all of us on this call know that there is racism happening in the Department of the Tempe Police. So you're saying that you've just blocked it out with your great communication. I'm not trying to attack you in any way, but
No.
I'm just a little frustrated that
I understand.
like we're being gaslighted in this moment to believe that racism isn't happening by a Black woman, which just seems like a tokenization of your Blackness in this moment, to be honest.
Well, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying it wasn't happening around me. If somebody wanted to do it somewhere else, you know, people know if I see something I don't like, I'm going to say it, you know? So like I said, nothing that, you know, I'm not saying my communication skills just kind of booted those things away, but if it was happening, it wasn't happening directly around me because I'm the type that will say something. So like I said, the things I have seen is just not understanding people's culture and understanding communication from different people. And like you said, if you were to get another officer on here, they may have other stories for you, but I mean, that's all I have as far as my experience with the Tempe Police Department and things that have happened around me.
Lindsey, to the question around, from what I heard in that experience you're talking about out in the community, right? When there's like a cop yelling at someone or, you know, and then you're trying to de-escalate. To me, is that what you shared? Like there are those situations where there's like, yeah, like yelling or whatever, different words, language used, and then that is different? Because I heard that, and what I'm thinking there is like, that's exactly part of the problem, right? Like, there are cops that do feel that they can talk to community like that are yelling, that are like escalating. And then what I heard that you were trying to de-escalate situations, and kind of like this question around like, I don't know what they're doing, and maybe there's just a communication skill, which I think for me goes back to, no, it's not actually not just a communication skill. Like I'm sure they talk to certain people certain way than others. And I'm sure another reason is because there's very little to no consequences to not treat people respectfully. But I just wanted to.
No, and I mean, and you know, people have to be careful with words that they use. You know, you have to be very careful with terms and labeling people as certain things because, you know, I know earlier I used the term bad guys. I was using that loosely, but I tell people you have to be careful with how you label people when you're out on the street, because you can begin to treat people that way before they've even given you an opportunity to, you know what I mean, to even have a good view of who they are. So labels are very important. Labels are very strong. I've had people assume I was a particular way, and by the time they're at the end of the call, they're like, "Oh, you weren't what I thought you were." And I'm like, "Well, I appreciate it. You know, I give me the time to show you who I am, and I'll give you the time to show me who you are as well." But yeah, I don't have an issue with stepping in and telling somebody, hey, maybe we should use this language, or maybe we don't have to be so aggressive when you're talking to somebody. And people get frustrated and don't always know how to change the subject or bring it back down, sometimes, because if you start coming up, there's nowhere to go. It's hard to come back down after you've been up for a certain amount of time. And now that other person's mad, and it's hard to communicate that way.
If you mind if I jump in, first off, Ms. Long, thank you for being brave enough to tell your truth, and introspectively aware enough to analyze your own issues and recognize that the things, your environment created issues with mental health. However, this is a one-of-one circumstance. There are the Tempe Police Department as a whole, they do not practice a culture of analyzing mental issues and how it affects the officers on patrol, how it affects the culture of the police department. So if anything, I don't feel that this is productive enough for us to establish any sort of momentum towards the policy changes that we're looking to enact. If anything, it further highlights the issue of the lack of accountability from mostly white police officers in this police department specifically. So my question is, how can we take this experience and pivot towards the change that we spent the past 4 or 5 meetings addressing, and specifically this past weekend creating policy changes for? How can we pivot towards this next plan of action?
Thanks, Jacob. And I saw Keisha's request also to pivot, which I offered, and when we have some time left in the session, and I think we should do that. I think we need to, I don't want to end this call today with the comments we've heard, but once again, I want to thank Lindsey. Lindsey represents a perspective that was requested by the task force. And Roy, thank you for saying it was you. I didn't want to show, I didn't feel like I needed to say who the task force members were. But to your point, as you're sharing, it was to share a perspective within the organization. Lindsey, please know that we appreciate you, the service, and for sharing of yourself. And we really appreciate it. So we're going to ask you to hop off, and then we're going to finish the conversation.
Thank you. You all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to be flexible, as we have always tried to meet people on this call. And let's have a conversation. We have time. Let's have a conversation about what's going on. And I encourage, especially those who are not sharing much, also to share with us and what we need to do at the next session and what we have planned.
If I may, real quick, I made a point earlier to say, I think some of I'm not saying all of it, I can't speak for everybody, but I think some of the frustration that's coming out is the worry and the concern that the work and the expertise that we are putting in, it may not be fully utilized, but whatever we decide or what we arrive at and what plans we plan to implement, how will they implement? Will they be implemented and reach the patrol level officers, the frontline officers, the police that are in the streets that our communities have to deal with and confront, or when they confront? Will this work reach them, and how will that reach them? I think that's important to be able to be understood and be established. If I'm missing a point from anybody in the group, please clarify with me. But I believe that that's a major concern of how will this work reach the frontline officers in the community.
Thank you. Can I just say, and then there's been this group called Tempe True Blue that's formed in the past few weeks, and it's been discussed in the Wrangler, and it's a number of Tempe businesses are joining, and it seems somehow they feel it's a reaction to the Public Advisory Task Force. And to me, it's concerning because it shows there might be an undercurrent of those that don't really respect what we're doing. And the people that don't respect what we're doing are the ones that need to really examine and understand what the issues are in the community.
I actually responded to that for a second as well, just on my end. So I actually reached out after the Wrangler article that you're talking about that you shared in the chat, Councilmember Cubie. I actually reached out to the person, to Mike Bradley, who started that group, and had a sit down meeting with him on Friday for about probably 30 to 45 minutes in my office, just because I wanted to have a discussion. We had a really good conversation. I think my goal was just to get a chance to meet him and to hear more about kind of why he chose to start the group and what his intentions are. But I frankly also wanted to share what my intentions were with starting this task force. Was, this is a group of 23 people, I believe, who bring a multitude of different experiences, and perspectives to this, and a lot of expertise and a lot of passion. And that the point of this group was to really have conversations about how we can collectively move forward and talk about reform and things that might need to be frankly changed and updated, not only within the city of Tempe, but frankly a lot of the concerns that have been raised on this call and others have been about culture, not just in Tempe, but frankly, statewide and nationally. And so my hope has always been that the work that we're doing here is frankly going to be so good that it's going to be utilized by other organizations talking about how to get things like this done and how to really impact policy that really changes departments for the positive, but obviously starting right here in the city of Tempe. So we had a good conversation about that, and I told him I appreciated his willingness to come and meet with me about it, but I think that, but my main thing with him was frankly just to make sure that I personally reached out to say, hey, I saw the article and I want to make sure that we're not going back and forth in media articles or social media, but that we sit down and have frankly, like an in-person conversation. But I appreciate the fact that he was willing to do that.
Thanks for mentioning that, Corey, and Councilmember Cubie as well for bringing it up. I want to tag on to a little bit from what Roy was talking about in terms of being heard and making sure that things, any recommendations are made that we can actually see some results on the, from the patrol officers themselves. I think that is part of the question that I have is willingness to change. So I think by the nature of us having this task force, I think we're seeing the city showing the community that you're open to listening, you're open to new ideas. But when we also see organizations like True Blue Tempe being formed and having officers that are on this call being quoted in that on their website and things like that, I'm not, if that organization was founded to be counteract, if you will, the task force and their recommendations, then what actual willingness to make any behavioral changes will there be within the police department themselves? We can recommend every cool new, technology to track things. We can recommend policy changes. We can recommend changes in training. But if there's not a willingness to change behavior and not an active, acknowledgement that, the community may not be understanding the perspectives of the voices that are in the community that are being affected by some perhaps antiquated police activity, then I don't know if what we're doing here on this task force is worth our time, if it's not going to be adopted and implemented all the way downstream.
Genevieve, I think if I could build on what you said for a moment, this is why I think that I don't understand why we're only focusing on behaviors and we're not talking about values and principles that actually inform the creation of law enforcement in Tempe as an institution and as a system. I don't know about anyone else, but I was deeply alarmed listening to Officer Long's story the entire time, because it was so clear to me that the conditioning that she has received has made it absolutely impossible for her to see racism, sexism, classism, anything that negatively affects her from the police force. She's so conditioned into this idea of silence around the blue badge, the uniform. She was saying lots of coded things that people say, like, attracting more flies with honey, and it's about different cultural differences, all these little red flags that people say all the time when they don't want to, when they're unable to, or not even don't want to, but when they're unable to physically understand and apply a lens of racism that isn't just the kind of racism that beats you up as a hate crime, right? The kind of racism, the kind of sexism that holds women back, that took 800,000 women out of the workforce during the pandemic and only 200,000 men, right? Like, that system is so deeply poisoned by systems of oppression that unless we have that conversation about principles, values, and how they're deeply entwined with upholding the status quo of these systems of oppression, behaviors won't cut it. It's not going to get anything done or change anything significantly, or even really at all.
Can I actually make a really quick point about that to Michael's point? I'm sorry, I don't want to cut anyone off. I think one of the things, I guess and I totally respect what Michael's saying. I think the differentiation that I made, whatever, in terms of, in terms of like Officer Love's comments, was that, I think what she was saying was, this is my personal experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the experience of everyone. As an example for myself personally, I mean, I'm the first African-American council member in Tempe history, the first mayor of the city of Tempe, who's African-American. And I have, during the time I've been in Tempe for almost 18 years now, I've maybe only had a couple of experiences with people, like with sort of members of the public that have been, from my perspective, like overtly racist, where someone has said something to me where I've gone like, wow. And actually, I've had a couple happen since I've become mayor, frankly, people who've just sent me emails where there was nothing coded about any of the language. I mean, they were clearly coming after me, and it was clearly racially motivated. I had a person who wrote something on Facebook about me, about the some of the challenges we have with homelessness. He said, well, perhaps Mayor Woods doesn't care about the homeless people down at the park because they're white and he's African-American and doesn't care. There's been a lot of this. So I've had probably less than 5 comments made to me in my public life about it. However, it doesn't mean that I don't think that as a community, or frankly, we as a state or as a country, still don't have tons of issues that we have to address in a very proactive fashion, and that we have to talk about, which I absolutely believe is the purpose for not only this call, but the entire task force and a lot of these conversations. But I think that the way I kind of looked at it was, she, more or less, that was sort of her personal perspective. But I definitely would agree that, from what she said, that was her experience. It may not be the experience of others. And if we had different people on the call, they may have expressed something very different, perhaps. So, but I definitely don't want to minimize anything you were saying, because I definitely, agree that racism is a challenge in our country and in our world, that it's something that we do have to openly discuss, not only as a task force, but frankly, as a society, if we're ever really going to attempt to make any serious headway.
Mayor, I understand.
Can I say something?
Can I just respond real quick? What my serious concern was that when she was asked to identify outside of her personal experience, things that she could observe, systems, institutions, women not being promoted at the same rates, women of color not being treated in the same ways, comments being made about people's hair. These things happen all the time. We know that. She couldn't do that. And that's a part of the conditioning, the training that's happening at the police force, to not see that from other police officers, right? To see other police officers as not the problem in any way, and as not influenced deeply by systems of oppression and bias.
No, I hear you. Thank you.
Can I say something? Because I've been really quiet. Can I say something real quick, Keisha? Because you all have hit it. I said you all have been handling it. I've been trying to be quiet. But there is something I do believe we need to, that's been touched upon, that I really want to really hit on. As a Black woman that was raised in the 70s and the 80s, we have been conditioned wherever we go, and not consciously and intentionally, but it is there, that we need to make sure everybody around us is comfortable. And when she says, I get more bees with honey and all of that, that is that making sure everyone's comfortable, making sure I'm accepted, making sure I'm approved of so that I can survive being in this profession. Now, I've spoken to many officers outside of Officer Lindsey, and I've spoke to Black female officers as well as Black male officers. And every last one of them have said that they have felt that they have had to code switch to set aside who they are in order to survive in this particular culture. And they can't say exactly what they really want to say to fellow white officers who behave racist and are anti-Black, anti-brown, or anti-whatever, because there's a fear of being retaliated against and pushed out. So in order for me to survive, I've been conditioned to say what needs to be said in a nice way and say stuff like, maybe you shouldn't have done it that way. Maybe you should try to understand someone else's culture. So we play it down a little bit. And I'm here to say that what my young people have been saying all along is that time out for owning someone else's discomfort with my presence. It's time out for all of that. And we've got to have the real conversations that need to be had about being Black, about being brown, about being different as you serve in the police department. And this culture, deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, I want to say it because it's true, deeply rooted in it. Because of that, it is also now manifested other antis, like anti-brown, anti-disability, anti-LGBTQ, and all this anti-stuff. And so we need to get to the heart of this and stop going around the fact that we have a white male supremacist issue in the police culture. That's the truth. And I know my white female officers go through this because I've talked to them too. And so we need to address the real deal, stop going around it, and address it. There is a white male supremacist ideology that is deeply rooted at the foundation of our police and an anti-Blackness. We have got to address those things, root that mess out completely so that we can get to what we really want to get to. But this stuff right here, this stuff we've been talking about in the breakout, I think is great, but we will never have the sustainable changes that we want to see until we address the root. And until we do that, and we're willing to have those uncomfortable conversations with those white male officers who continue to promote this foolishness, till we're ready to have that conversation, this is a waste of time, for real. And I've sat on these calls 3 hours, 3 hours, 3 hours, and it's done. I'm done with sitting on here until we're ready to have the real conversation and have it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but we got to do it with our white male officers and superiors and the individuals who really need to be involved in this conversation. Thank you. I'm quiet. I'm gonna be quiet.
And I would say, if you find that they are not willing or don't want to participate, then I think the city really needs to consider who should be police officers. If they're not willing to come to the conversation and have these real conversations like Janelle just suggested.
I have to jump in third with that. Janelle, that was right out the park. I personally feel that anything else is just optics. We really appreciate the story that Lindsey had provided, but that is not it's not indicative of the accountability for any of the officers at that department. That's why we're here in the first place. It is about the uncomfortable conversations. It's about honesty. You know, if someone is clear in their intent to right a wrong, then first they admit that they are the root of the issue. And right now, the Tempe Police Department is the root of the issue. So it would behoove them to show up with their hands out, acknowledge that there are issues that they have perpetuated throughout their history. And that's the way we could start to see some change out here. I really appreciate what Janelle and Roy said.
I'd like to add, and thank you, Janelle, for that, but I think we have to go even bigger than Tempe. I think it's a symptom. We need to look at our laws in Arizona. We've got to change those. I mean, even the Tempe Citizens Review Panel is defined in Tempe code. we keep going after the police, but they're a symptom. They're not, like, that's what's coming out. We need to change the laws in Arizona. We need to look at these laws and we need to change the Tempe codes, because until we do that, no matter what we change in a PD, the codes are still there. And so I think we need to look bigger. We need to look at those things. And I appreciate everyone on here. But I also want to make sure we talk about some uncomfortable things as unconscious bias that seems to come out in this whole meeting. We can't assume anybody here understands what anybody else feels or experiences. And I think Lindsey did great. And you got to remember, and maybe you don't know, Lindsey was shot 3 times in the line of duty. We're talking about not just racism and that. We're talking about mental health in law enforcement, what's available to law enforcement. And honestly, if Lindsey wasn't shot, she wouldn't have been able to retire. So we got to deal with that issue. The mental health piece for law enforcement is not covered in Arizona. It has to be unusual, unexpected, and extraordinary for an officer to get help. And unless you understand that, we cannot address 25 years of exposure in the streets. And there's a lot of fear there and a lot of reaction. So we have to look at training, we have to look at mental health, but we're not dealing with the laws, we're not dealing with guns, we're not dealing with violence in Tempe, and we're not dealing with the fact that unless you're shot in the line of duty, and even then, it may not be covered by services for them. And we have to be services, because an officer who's in an event has a dead kid may have to go on another call 20 minutes later. Do you want that person responding to a call for service after they just went through a traumatic event? But that's what happens. And so we need to look at how do we help our officers, and so we don't have reactions. We don't have officers triggered by fear, but they don't get to leave duty because that's the way Tempe runs. You take the next call and the next call and the next call.
And I think to take the community into account in that scenario, Robbie, is to flip that scenario around, because you have people who live in poverty, who are raised in, abusive households, who then grow up with post-traumatic stress syndrome or whatever anxiety or, whatever that those mental health issues are. And what do you think happens to them? They go into the community and they cope in ways that are harmful to other people or themselves, and they get called the bad guys, right? So now we have mentally ill people chasing other mentally ill people, and one of them has the power to kill another, And so we're not addressing the root cause, that the crime rates that are there are coming from years and years and years of being raised in environments where you have no access to mental health, no access to proper resources for food and housing, and no proper resources to address even in-home trauma that could be happening, because parents who could be abusing their children, that's a trauma response. And then those children grow up to be considered criminals and considered bad people, because they're reacting or responding to the trauma that they've been raised in. So how do we address those root causes on both sides, rather than continuously criminalizing one over another? We criminalize those in the community who have these mental health issues and struggles in the community, but we justify the fact that, these officers have to deal with all of these, traumatic situations, and that's why they could potentially be responding in an ill-mannered way, and we justify their actions, but we don't give the community the same benefit of the doubt. So that, therein lies a huge disparity that we're not addressing, we're not even talking about in these meetings.
Yeah, and I'm not justifying any of it. What I'm saying is, I agree with you.
I'm talking about the overarching problem. I'm not necessarily saying you specifically.
Right, and I think the trauma is what we have to look at. But we have a juvenile corrections program that in Tempe, now they only get three sessions. We used to get a lot more sessions when kids got referred to the diversion program. What happened to that? I mean, why are we cutting it? And I can tell you a lot of history of cutting services in Tempe. And I agree, let's put those services in place so we don't need PD to respond to it. I want those services in place, but yeah, I agree with you, Keisha, totally. So much of it comes out of trauma and reaction. and we need to treat it, but we got to put the services in place. We can't keep cutting the services and expecting a different outcome.
Right, we're the 47th state in education, you know, like that, there's a problem there. If we're raising children who have no access to quality education, what type of minds do you think they're gonna have and they grow up? They're not gonna have the minds of critical analysis. They're not gonna be able to critically critically analyze a situation that they may be in that could, you know, choose a more positive outcome rather than a more negative outcome if all they know is negative, if they have a limited, if their reading ability is only 5th grade level, you know, like these are all issues that come from systemic oppression and systemic racism.
And I agree totally. I was the first female psychologist to go into juvenile courts and do psych evals, and we kept saying, don't lock them up, treat them. They need to be in different programs. But Arizona is a lock them up state. It's not a treatment focused state. And there's other states that have these diversion programs. And treating this trauma that is rampant. And I agree with you, Keisha, when you grow up in this culture of trauma, we need to intervene early. But in Arizona, a 14-year-old can be tried as an adult. You know, I mean, it's crazy.
In the street.
Right. So I think we need to focus on what can we do early intervention, 0 to 3, kids in schools. Let's educate kids in schools. Let's put trauma programs, mental health into schools in Tempe. We try to do that with Tempe Social Services, put a therapist in every school in Tempe or more so we can offer those services, get them into the trenches. But I was hoping we could talk about that. So I agree that let's take better care of our kids. I had suggested to a previous mayor that we have a Tempe children's program, that we look at what's it like for a kid in Tempe. And we've never talked about that, where other states have and cities have children's task force. What's it like to grow up in Tempe? And can we get early intervention services? Can we get into the schools? Can we talk about these things early on? Let's not wait till their brains have developed with trauma. And we know there's developmental trauma disorder that affects the developing brain. So I was hoping we could talk about early intervention and doing stuff a lot earlier, not wait, and to have this path to prison kind of thing that's crazy.
Right. And, you know, an issue is consistently raised about budget and not having the money, and we have to cut school funding because we just don't have enough money to fund schooling, but yet we have enough money to buy military grade weapons, and we have enough money to buy tanks, and we have enough money to put M16s or M14s, whatever they're called, on the back of motorcycle cops in the city of Tempe. You know, so we have money. It's just a matter of how we're allocating that money and how it's being used.
Sounds like it almost sounds like if you sold that paramilitary gear, reallocated budget, you resolve a lot of these issues. That's a completely different conversation.
I think this is
where the danger comes in. Sorry.
I think this is, I'm just looking at the clock and I'm trying to respect everyone's time. I know that this is a very lively conversation. I just am looking at, and I need perhaps some agreement that the next session, we're not going to have breakout sessions. I would like to pick up where we left off here. We're going to send kind of the groupings that we had today, which is the framework of the strategic plan. To Michael's point, we will start off as we did in the beginning sessions of the Tempe values and talk about that. I think it would be good to revisit the scope of the task force in the beginning as a group of a whole, and our commitment to, we know the real work happens when we all feel uncomfortable. So today may not have been linear, may not have been exactly what everyone had anticipated, but we're speaking and we're having dialogue about things that we need to consider to place on that strategic plan. So I really urge you to think about that. And to Roy's point, from someone who has been a therapist in this organization for 28 years, whether formally or informally, implementation plan of whatever you create and to honor your work and your time has to be, the implementation plan has to be what I always say, not about someone, without them. So I think that was Roy's point about bringing in an officer and to understand their life, because we're going to need all hands on deck in order to implement this, in order to evaluate, in order to hire, all the things that we need to change that we understand, but we can't have it without the officers at the table to implement. And I would also ask our city manager at the next session and Mayor, up to you, if we can talk about also the implementation plan or how your work is going to be honored in a way that we implement. And I think it's always helpful to know, starting with the end in mind, that this is going to happen. Come hell or high water, this is going to happen, folks. And maybe that's my own commitment to all of you as a resident and as part of this task force, but this is going to happen. So please know that today may not have been linear, but people are talking perhaps who'd never speak. And I'm going to be honest with you. And I think it ended up having a conversation that I need others to participate in. So I'm going to go on a limb and say no breakout sessions next time. I think we all need to have a conversation and continue this. We'll send the framework. So it's our homework this time, not you. And we'll send this to you for you to look at, and then we'll start the conversation in January, new year, that we're all looking forward to. With that, any questions? And then I'll turn it over to the mayor.
So I guess just a quick thing too. Once again, I agree with Rose's assessment. I see some other folks in the chat talking as well about not having breakout sessions. I completely agree with that. I think we're definitely at a point in the process where as we could have really kind of put pen to paper and talking about what policy recommendations we all want to see come out of this group. I think the best thing would be for us to all kind of talk in a large group setting. And if that takes 3 hours, it takes 3 hours. But I think that we've probably gathered enough input from meeting in the small groups that we can come and have this discussion. And I agree, it's a very courageous conversation we're all having right now, whatever. And it's a tough one. I said it's uncomfortable. But the reality is we all knew at the beginning and the onset of this that some of these conversations were going to have to be uncomfortable if we're going to get to a place where we can all truly get what we want and move forward. So I appreciate everyone's willingness to really take part of this and to frankly be honest, direct, and candid, because that's the only way that we're going to really get a document out of this and recommendations that are really going to make a real difference. So I appreciate our staff once again for facilitating this. I appreciate all the members of the task force for being here, and I'm just looking forward to the next meeting. And just before I go, just obviously have a very safe and happy holiday. As I said to everyone before in the chat, if anyone ever wants to talk to me offline, I agree that these discussions need to be had in public. But if you want to talk to me at any point offline, I am here, not traveling at all, obviously due to COVID. So I'm around. If you want to talk by phone or whatever it is, I'm available to you whenever you want. So maybe just not for 2 hours on Christmas when I'm with my 81-year-old dad. But other than that, I will make myself available to you. So thank you.
I just had a request from one of the task force members, if it's okay to share contact information for others up to the group. Okay. We will send contact information to all of you for each other's on the task force. That's all I had. Thank you, everyone, sincerely. And have a safe holiday, and we'll see you for 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rosa.
God bless
Thank you,
everybody.
Whitell.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you
holiday.
today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everybody.